He tried to extricate himself from the narrow quarters of the desk, but for an embarrassing moment found that he was stuck fast. Johnny Spencer instinctively gave him an assisting push, and once free, the great soldier, statesman, and millionaire took a few steps forward to the open floor. Then, after hesitating a moment, he mounted the little platform and stood in the teacher's place. Marilla Hender was as pale as ashes. "I have thought many times," the great guest began, "that some day I should come back to visit this place, which is so closely interwoven with the memories of my childhood. In my counting room, on the fields of war, in the halls of Congress, and most of all in my Western home, my thoughts have flown back to the hills and brooks of Winby and to this little old schoolhouse. I could shut my eyes and call back the buzz of voices and fear my teacher's frown and feel my boyish ambitions waking and stirring in my breast. On that bench where I just sat, I saw some notches that I cut with my first jackknife 58 years ago this very spring. I remember the faces of the boys and girls who went to school with me, and I see their grandchildren before me. I know that one is a Goodsoe and another a Wynne by the old family look. One generation goes and another comes. There are many things that I might say to you. I meant, even in those early restricted days, to make my name known, and I dare say that you too have ambition. Be careful what you wish for in this world, for if you wish hard enough, you are sure to get it. I once heard a very wise man say this, and the longer I live, the more firmly I believe it to be true. But wishing hard means working hard for what you want, and the world's prizes wait for the men and women who are ready to take pains to win them. Be careful and set your minds on the best things. I meant to be a rich man when I was a boy here, and I stand before you a rich man, knowing the care and anxiety and responsibility of wealth. I meant to go to Congress, and I am one of the senators from Kansota. I say this as humbly as I say it proudly. I used to read of the valor and patriotism of the old Greeks and Romans with my youthful blood leaping along my veins, and it came to pass that my own country was in danger, and that I could help to fight her battles. Perhaps some one of these little lads has before him a more eventful life than I have lived, and is looking forward to activity and honor and the pride of fame. I wish him all the joy that I have had, all the toil that I have had, and all the bitter disappointments even. For adversity leads a man to depend upon that which is above him, and the path of glory is a lonely path, beset by temptations and a bitter sense of the weakness and imperfection of man. I see my life spread out like a great picture as I stand here in my boyhood's place. I regret my failures. I thank God for what in His kind providence has been honest and right. I am glad to come back, but I feel, as I look in your young faces, that I am an old man, while your lives are just beginning. When you remember, in years to come, that I came here to see the old schoolhouse, remember that I said, wish for the best things, and work hard to win them. Try to be good men and women, for the honor of the school and the town, and the noble young country that gave you birth. Be kind at home, and generous abroad. Remember that I, an old man who had seen much of life, begged you to be brave and good. The Honorable Mr. Laneway had rarely felt himself so moved in any of his public speeches, but he was obliged to notice that for once he could not hold his audience. The primer class especially had begun to flag in attention, but one or two faces among the elder scholars fairly shone with vital sympathy and a lovely prescience of their future. Their eyes met his as if they struck a flash of light. There was a sturdy boy who half rose in his place unconsciously, the color coming and going in his cheeks. Something in Mr. Laneway's words lit the altar flame in his reverent heart. Marilla Hender was pleased and a little dazed. She could not have repeated what her illustrious visitor had said, but she longed to tell everybody the news that he was in town and had come to school to make an address. She had never seen a great man before, and really needed time to reflect upon him and to consider what she ought to say. She was just quivering with the attempt to make a proper reply and thank Mr. Laneway for the honor of his visit to the school, when he asked her which of the boys could be trusted to drive back his hired horse to the Four Corners. 8 boys, large and small, nearly every boy in the school, rose at once and snapped insistent fingers. But Johnny Spencer alone was desirous not to attract attention to himself. The Colburns' intellectual arithmetic with a portrait had been well secreted between his tight jacket and his shirt. Miss Hender selected a trustworthy, freckled person in long trousers who was halfway to the door in an instant, and was heard almost immediately to shout loudly at the quiet horse. Then the hero of District Number 4 made his acknowledgments to the teacher. "I fear that I have interrupted you too long," he said, with pleasing deference. Marilla replied that it was of no consequence. She hoped he would call again. She may have spoken primly, but her pretty eyes said everything that her lips forgot. "My grandmother will want to see you, sir," she ventured to say. "I guess you will remember her. Miss Hender, she that was Abby Harron. She has often told me how you used to get your lessons out of the same book." Abby Harron's granddaughter? Mr. Laneway looked at her again with fresh interest. "Yes, I wish to see her more than anyone else. Tell her that I am coming to see her before I go away, and give her my love. Thank you, my dear," as Marilla offered his missing hat. "Goodbye, boys and girls." He stopped and looked at them once more from the boys' entry, and turned again to look back from the very doorstep. Part 2. The Honorable Mr. Laneway found the outdoor air very fresh and sweet after the closeness of the schoolhouse. It had just that same odor in his boyhood, and as he escaped he had a delightful sense of playing truant or of having an unexpected holiday. It was easier to think of himself as a boy and to slip back into his boyish thoughts than to bear the familiar burden of his manhood. He climbed the tumble-down stone wall across the road, and went along a narrow path to the spring that bubbled up clear and cold under a great red oak. How many times he had longed for a drink of that water, and now here it was, and the thirst of that warm spring day was hard to quench. Again and again he stopped to fill the birch-bark dipper which the children had made, just as his own comrades made theirs years before. The oak tree was dying at the top. The pine woods beyond had been cut and had grown again since his boyhood, and looked much as he remembered them. Beyond the spring and away from the woods, the path led across overgrown pastures to another road, perhaps 3/4 of a mile away, and near this road was the small farm which had been his former home. As he walked slowly along, he was met again and again by some reminder of his youthful days. He had always liked to refer to his early life in New England in his political addresses, and had spoken more than once of going to find the cows at nightfall in the autumn evenings, and being glad to warm his bare feet in the places where the sleepy beasts had lain, before he followed their slow steps homeward through bush and briar. The Honorable Mr. Laneway had a touch of true sentiment, which added much to his really stirring and effective campaign speeches. He had often been called the king of the platform in his adopted state. He had long ago grown used to saying "Go" to one man and come to another, like the ruler of old. But all his natural power of leadership and habit of authority disappeared at once as he trod the pasture slopes, calling back the remembrance of his childhood. Here was the place where two lads, older than himself, had killed a terrible woodchuck at bay in the angle of a great rock. And just beyond was the sunny spot where he had picked a bunch of pink and white anemones under a prickly barberry thicket to give to Abby Harron in morning school. She had put them into her desk and let them wilt there, but she was pleased when she took them. Abby Harron, the little teacher's grandmother, was a year older than he, and had wakened the earliest thought of love in his youthful breast. It was almost time to catch the first sight of his birthplace. From the knoll, just ahead, he had often seen the light of his mother's lamp as he came home from school on winter afternoons. But when he reached the knoll, the old house was gone, and so was the great walnut tree that grew beside it. And a pang of disappointment shot through this devout pilgrim's heart. He never had doubted that the old farm was somebody's home still, and had counted upon the pleasure of spending a night there and sleeping again in that room under the roof, where the rain sounded loud and the walnut branches brushed to and fro when the wind blew, as if they were the claws of tigers. He hurried across the worn-out fields, long ago turned into sheep pastures, where the last year's tall grass and goldenrod stood gray and winter killed, tracing the old walls and fences, and astonished to see how small the fields had been. The prosperous owner of western farming lands could not help remembering those widespread luxuriant acres and the broad outlooks of his western home. It was difficult at first to find exactly where the house had stood. Even the foundations had disappeared. At last, in the long, faded grass, he discovered the doorstep, and nearby was a little mound where the great walnut tree stump had been. The cellar was a mere dent in the sloping ground. It had been filled in by the growing grass and slow processes of summer and winter weather. But just at the pilgrim's right were some thorny twigs of an old rose bush. A sudden brightening of memory brought to mind the love that his mother, dead since his 15th year, had kept for this sweetbriar. How often she had wished that she had brought it to her new home. So much had changed in the world, so many had gone into the world of light, and here the faithful blooming thing was yet alive. There was one slender branch where green buds were starting and getting ready to flower in the new year. The afternoon wore late, and still the gray-haired man lingered. He might have laughed at someone else, who gave himself up to sad thoughts, and found fault with himself, with no defendant to plead his cause at the bar of conscience. It was an altogether lonely hour. He had dreamed all his life, in a sentimental, self-satisfied fashion, of this return to Winby. It had always appeared to be a grand affair, but so far he was himself the only interested spectator at his poor occasion. There was even a dismal consciousness that he had been undignified, perhaps even a little consequential and silly, in the old schoolhouse. The picture of himself on the warpath in Johnny Spencer's arithmetic was the only tribute that this longed-for day had held, but he laughed aloud delightedly at the remembrance, and really liked that solemn little boy who sat at his own old desk. There was another older lad who sat at the back of the room, who reminded Mr. Laneway of himself in his eager youth. There was a spark of light in that fellow's eyes. Once or twice in the earlier afternoon, as he drove along, he had asked people in the road if there were a Laneway family in that neighborhood, but everybody had said no in indifferent fashion. Somehow he had been expecting that everyone would know him and greet him and give him credit for what he had tried to do. But old Winby had her own affairs to look after, and did very well without any of his help. Mr. Laneway acknowledged to himself at this point that he was weak and unmanly. There must be some old friends who would remember him, and give him as hearty a welcome as the greeting he had brought for them. So he rose and went his way westward toward the sunset. The air was growing damp and cold, and it was time to make sure of shelter. This was hardly like the visit he had meant to pay his birthplace. He wished with all his heart that he had never come back. But he walked briskly away, intent upon wider thoughts as the fresh evening breeze quickened his steps. He did not consider where he was going, but was for a time the busy man of affairs, stimulated by the unconscious influence of his surroundings. The slender gray birches and pitch pines of that neglected pasture had never before seen a hat and coat exactly in the fashion. They may have been abashed by the presence of a United States senator and Western millionaire, though a piece of New England ground that had often felt the tread of his bare feet was not likely to quake because a pair of smart shoes stepped hastily along the schoolhouse path.